celebrate with Feminist Economics today. This distinguished journal has added intellectual profile to the Center and Rice for these 30 years. And it has added global reach, unbelievable global reach to the Center and to Rice. It's very exciting to hear about it. We're going to hear about its past, probably something about its future today. And I just want to offer many congratulations to Diana Strassmann and our visitors and everybody, many of you in the audience who have contributed to making this journal a success. It's really a remarkable occasion. So I'll turn things over to Myra. Yeah.
Is this better? Yeah. Okay, great, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's hard to believe, but 30 years ago, I signed a contract on behalf of the International Association for Feminist Economics, IAFE, with our publisher, Routledge, to publish the journal Feminist Economics. And indeed, we have one of the journal's first employees, Thuy Lin Roshanger, who is here today, who helped me pick out the journal cover. So it was really a long time ago, but maybe not quite so long ago. After signing the contract, we sent out our first call for papers and began accepting submissions. And of course, in those days, it was all in paper, 5 copies, and everything was done through mail, and we still have boxes of all that in the journal closet. Actually, the team of students, many of whom are here today, helping me figure out what to do with those boxes, and they are going into an archive. So that's at Duke University's History of Political Economy archive. So that's exciting. It was a lot of work to get the journal off the ground. Many of you may not know that I didn't start my career doing research on gender. My passion and the reason I decided to get a PhD in economics was, and it's still a passion, but was environmental policy. And I went to graduate school in economics because I believed that economists had the tools to really save the planet. Well, I've since been corrected. It's a little more complicated than that. But that was the topic of my undergraduate senior thesis and earliest publications. But when I got to graduate school at Harvard, I encountered some ideas that I hadn't expected from including the person who was to be my mentor, who I had gone there to work with. And I won't say his name, but I'll tell you later if you want to know. But he began arguing publicly in seminars that the tax system should discourage married women from having jobs and employment because, he said, they should be home with their children. And Jeff and I were dating. We weren't married yet, but I anticipated a future where I might have children, and wasn't sure it was the best career move to work with a guy who thought that if I had kids, I should be taxed into staying at home. And I then, heard a few other stories about this guy that actually every woman who went to Harvard to work with him either dropped out and went to law school, or or he published her research under his name and so forth. So then I ended up just talking, interviewing professors. They didn't know they were being interviewed by me, but I just decided, well, let me find someone who I thought would treat me with some modicum of respect, being a woman. And that's how I ended up in a field I had never studied before, called industrial organization, and why I wrote my PhD dissertation on pricing in the airline industry, which is a bit of an irony, but anyway. One of the conclusions of my dissertation was that mergers of airlines should be treated with great suspicion and were probably inadvisable. So when Rice hired me in 1983, I was told by a colleague that they were proud of finally finding a woman, the first woman in a tenure-track position in the econ department, who didn't do labor economics, which was the one field of economics where gender sometimes was addressed or came up, in a way that feminist economists would later deem add women and stir. So my experiences as the first tenure-track woman in Rice's econ department were a little eye-opening, and it led me to decide that while quite a few economists were studying environmental concerns and economic regulation, gender-related research was pretty pitiful in its failure to explain important economic phenomena, such as the research that Amartya Sen had published in 1990, showing that at that time, his estimates showed that there were 100 million women who were dead, who would have been alive if they had had equal access to the basic resources needed for survival. Whereas economists doing labor economics, which I learned about because I got a small NSF grant to study labor economics, because I thought, well, maybe I should learn that, was that basically women were in lower paying jobs because they preferred them. Anyway, so I began exploring. Then I had children and it led me to think maybe there was some other research that might be worth my attention. But I then discovered that my colleagues didn't really think that gender in economics was compatible, and that I even had a colleague tell me that if I began to pursue this, that it would lead to the graveyard. Well, I'm still alive. Anyway, I organized a session at the American Economics Association called "Can Feminism Find a Home in Economics?" Actually, Claudia Golden was on the panel, which was interesting. And it turned out that they gave us a very small room. It was standing room only. And that panel led to my co-founding the International Association for Feminist Economics, during which time I discovered that I wasn't alone, that there were many other people who had similar interests in economics. But a difficulty was that economics journals were not publishing this research. So it wasn't enough for us to network and know each other. But actually, what I discovered, again, from talking to my colleagues, was that if I was doing research that no economics journal would publish, then it couldn't be deemed economics. And so that is one of the reasons I began thinking we needed a journal. But I had another important life event that caused me to decide that this really needed to be a priority. In the summer of 1992, I lost a child who was stillborn because the medical protocols were not based on sound economic analysis. And I can tell you more about all the flaws, but it was really just devastating to both of us. And I explored that area of medical flaws and did some early studies, but quickly discovered that without a medical degree, I couldn't really have any voice of substance in that. But I was aware that there were many more babies and children dying as a result of economic policies that were unaccountable to all human populations. And that also the flaws in economics leading to adverse impacts affecting women and children and men as well, they were not the there were other really egregious disparities, including an economics that failed to acknowledge sexual orientation-related inequities, and an economics built on racism and racist economic policies and colonialism and other class-related differences and so forth. So when I began the journal, I wanted to think about how the journal could avoid the narrow blinders of current disciplinary hierarchies. And I realized that it couldn't be just what I thought a better economics would look like, but needed to reflect the voices of those who are not currently in economic conversations at all. And so that our processes needed to reflect our principles as well. And I put a lot of thought into thinking about what that would look like. And indeed, there were some articles that we published that I might have preferred not to have published, but we published because we wanted to have processes that also reflected our feminist principles. And I could talk a lot about that, but I also want to give our other panelists a chance to say something. So what I do want to say is that as a result, and in part because it's the nature of journals, it's been built by the work of many. And I'm so happy that many of you are here in this room today. I also want to acknowledge some other firsts, that the very first student that I taught feminist economics to, Myra Jennings, is here in the room, and I had to get special dispensation from Rice. It was the previous Rice president who made it possible, or forced the economics department to let her take a course that I created for her. And anyway, what I'm not going to talk about now, I might say a little bit about it later, but I hope our speakers will attest to, is really, well, what has the journal accomplished? What is the significance of the research published in the journal over the past 30 years? And I'm looking forward to their comments. I'm not going to give long introductions so that we can spend more time talking, but I want to acknowledge Jane Humphries as the longest serving associate editor of Feminist Economics. She was in our very first issue and is still an active associate editor. Myra Stober and Cecilia Conrad, also long serving associate editors of the journal, and all three of them have also guest edited very distinguished special issues of the journal. And so without more ado, I would like to turn the floor over to our next speaker, Myra Stober.
Thank you all. It is really a pleasure to be here. When Diana asked me if I would come and speak, my first thought was, Diana is one of my heroines. Of course I'm coming to Houston to honor her and the journal. There is so much to celebrate here. Diana, the journal, Rice University, who made this possible, Routledge, who took a chance on the journal, but most of all, Diana. Many of you know what hard work it is to edit a journal. Now think about what it's like not only to edit a journal, but to start a journal from scratch. And that's what Diana did. She had a very clear vision of what she wanted to do. She also, as she indicated, was active apart from the journal in the American Economics Association. She held a session. She wrote up the session. She got approval from the AEA, which was amazing for the session. And that was the first session on feminist economics at the American Economics Association. Some people have asked me, not here, but in general, can you summarize feminist economics? What is it? So it's easier to say what it's not. It's not that women and men have a different economics, although sometimes I think they do. And it's not that we think that women and men do economic analysis in different ways. It's the subject matter. And Julie Nelson, who really is one of the founders of Feminist Economics, found early on that Adam Smith, who certainly is the founder of economics altogether, thought that economics was about provisioning, and that the profession had lost its way, because now the profession thought that economics was about efficiency and choice and rational behavior and selfishness, and provisioning kind of got lost somewhere in there. And Julie was very much interested in bringing provisioning back to the center. And when I talk at the end of my talk here about the future, I want to come back to that notion of provisioning. What about the question of the journal's impact? So the usual way that academics measure impact is, a citation count or the number of papers submitted. And while that's important, it surely is not the whole story, because feminist economics has implications and impact far beyond that. I was thinking about that this week when I saw that the International Monetary Fund held a symposium with Agnes Deaton, who has won the Nobel Prize, and Jayati Ghosh, who is on the faculty at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and a British economist whose name I've forgotten. Can you help me? You don't remember? She's at Cambridge, not Oxford. Anyway, the three of them are talking. Yes, thank you. Only Jayati Ghosh talks about what she's doing in terms of feminist economics. But the other two are clearly doing feminist economics. And the International Monetary Fund is interested in going beyond the usual questions that it deals with. So feminist economics has had an impact far beyond what the citation index might tell you. Let me give you a sense of how important the journal was when it began. How countercultural it was to the economics profession. I was interested in childcare, and I was the first woman ever to teach at the Stanford Business School. I came on the faculty in 1972. And then they asked me to give a seminar to the economics group. It was 15 white men and me. And the school itself had 90 white men and me. So, but I didn't talk to the whole school. I talked only to the economists. And I never got beyond the first sentence of my paper. I said that I thought that childcare was similar to education in that it was a public good and it needed to be subsidized. Well, my colleagues went berserk. First they started yelling at me, then they started yelling at each other. And the man who was in charge of the seminar never restored order. And I was a brand new assistant professor. How am I going to restore order? I should have started banging my head down, but I didn't. And so truly, 50 minutes passed, and I never said another word about anything. And then they all got up and left. And that afternoon, several of them came to my office individually, and I got the same message Diana did. Don't do that kind of work. Don't do that work. Do something, as they put it, mainstream. And then one guy told me, once you get 10, you can do whatever the hell you want. But in the meantime, don't do anything like that. And so I was walking home, and I thought to myself, I'm an economist, they don't pay me enough to sell my soul. If they don't want me to do this work, I'll stay here for a while, I'll do the work, and then when they turn me down for tenure, I'll go work for the Bank of America or the Fed or something, and because my husband loved Stanford and he wasn't moving, so we were staying at Stanford. And then I wrote a paper. Well, I kept doing work on childcare and other things, but I wrote a paper with 2 of my doctoral students. We went to visit childcare centers. Imagine economists actually going to visit childcare centers. And we went with an economist sensibility. We asked about training. We wanted to know what kind of training these childcare workers had. We wanted to know about their pay. We wanted to know about recruitment. We wanted to know about the budgets of the childcare centers. We were not particularly interested in child development, although one of the aides, I'll never forget this, told me that she so appreciated the training that she got because children were biting each other and she didn't understand why. And the training explained to her why children bite each other and what she might do about it. Mind you, the training took place at the child care center after hours because none of these child care workers, either the teachers or the aides, had cars that would enable them to go to the community college that provided the training to get the training at the community college. And so to the community college's credit, it came to the child care center and did this training. So I wrote a paper with my 2 students about child care centers as workplaces. I could not get that paper published in any economics journal. This is just not methodologically what economists do. They don't go around and talk to people. And child care, why would you want to talk about child care? And so then Feminist Economics is accepting papers. You could submit to Feminist Economics. And I'm proud to say that I published my article on child care centers as workplaces in the very first issue of Feminist Economics. Today, all these years later, there's still almost no economic work on child care. In fact, there's no work, period. Except periodically in Congress, some valiant representative introduces a bill which goes nowhere. So childcare is a public good, and now we have all the brain research, which we didn't have 30 years ago, which tells you how important it is, and yet nothing's happening because we are not in a provisioning mindset. Why are we not provisioning childcare? I have students who graduated from the Stanford Business School, marrying, two MBAs marrying each other, have very nice incomes, nonetheless could not find childcare. This is in the Bay Area, it's not in the boonies someplace. They simply could not find it. And I've heard this story so many times. But we need something even bigger than going around talking to child care center workers. We need planning on a national level. What kind of child care system should we have? How should we integrate it with employment? All the demographers are telling us that people are going to live longer and longer. So maybe we should have a child care system which says when you have a child, mother and father or any 2 parents or grandparents or whoever get to take time off from work to actually take care of an infant for, 6 months, 8 months. Infant childcare is so expensive because the ratio has to basically be, if not 1-to-1, 1-to-2. Maybe we should think bigger. We should think about a childcare system where women can nurse their own children if they want to, and they'd be out of the workforce for some period of time, or the father is out of the workforce, and then we have childcare. We shouldn't make the mistake, which I think we made with regard to health care, and leave childcare to employers We don't want our child care to be part of employers. Then if somebody is happy with their child care but hates their job, now what do? They have to quit. And then their child is left without child. It doesn't make sense to have a system like that. But nobody's thinking about these things because we are not thinking about provisioning. In this article by Agnes Deaton in the International Monetary Fund seminar, he talked about the fact that economists do not think about power relations. When they think about price setting or wage setting, whatever supply and demand issues they think about, they don't think about power relations in that. And we don't think about power relations among economists. We don't think about the power relations that allow the economics profession to say to people, you can't get tenure if you do work on this. Or in my case, I'm wondering if it's the same professor that Diana encountered. I had the shortest interview on record at the Harvard Economics Department. I went in, and the guy closed the door, and I sat down. He said to me, are you normal? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, do you want to get married and have children? I said, yes. He stood up, opened the door, and he said, well, there you have it. So, we have power relations within the discipline that we do not recognize. And I'm always interested in the fact that Daniel Kahneman and Tversky probably did some of the most interesting work in economics. They were psychologists. They didn't have to come before an economics tenure committee for their work. They probably wouldn't have made it. But they came up through psychology and did economics and were very successful. We should think about the power relations in the discipline. We have some very important issues coming up in our society, in addition to childcare and work and so on. If in fact people live longer, are they going to be able to retire at 65? If you live to 100, can you live on your income that you earned up till 65? For most people, probably not. What are we going to do about that? Everybody's concerned about the birth rate. Okay, well, be that as it may. But how are we going to support people, or how are people going to support themselves as they move into later life? And are they going to be relying on the education they got when they were in their 20s? Who is going to be responsible for continuing education? Businesses? Well, to some degree, yes. But probably the education system needs to take that on, and nobody's talking very much about that. The college curriculum is now much more focused on work than it is on, the liberal arts. And maybe that's partially because of economists who keep looking at education as preparation for work, and how much more income do you get with more education. So we need to think about how people are going to be educated for changing jobs, for living till age 100 and so on. We're not doing any of that. Let me end as I began. Thank you, Diana. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your creativity. Thank you for making all of this happen.
I just realized that I've heard now that same question about normal in a job interview at the Fed. I was asked, how did he know that all of my plans in terms of finishing my PhD and my dissertation weren't going to be disrupted because I would meet some nice guy and get married? So when I heard that, I thought, oh boy, everybody has heard those stories. My feminist economics story really begins a little bit at Wellesley College, where I realized I was privileged to be in an environment where economics was a female discipline. There were people there who were teaching. I remember having a course that was taught by Ann Seidman and Diane Painter on women and economic development, and it got me very excited about the potential for economics to help me understand some of the questions that fascinated me. Largely questions about inequality, about poverty, about why there were so much wealth on the one hand and people suffering on the other hand, and also questions about race. So imagine when I got to graduate school at Stanford and first of all discovered there were no women on the faculty. I'm not sure why I didn't research that before, but that was pre-internet, so maybe we weren't so. In the economics department, that there was one other woman in my entering class and one other black person in my entering class. So it was a very, very different experience. But in particular, when I got into some of the subject matter courses, I remember a graduate course in labor economics where some of the lessons were as follows. The first had to do with the notion that people who were not in the paid labor force were not working. And this troubled me quite a bit because I saw how much work went on inside the household. The second component, though, was the notion that married women had very low labor force participation rates, which was true for white women, but was not so true for black women. And in the community that I grew up in, my mother was kind of unusual in not working outside the home for pay. So I was troubled by that. I was troubled by the explanations for unemployment. And I remember actually being seen in a economic textbook at one point, a cartoon that had two labels. And it was supposed to be the unemployment office. And one said recession, and they showed a line of people waiting who were both black and white. And then they said full employment, and they showed a line of black people waiting. All of these things kind of made me have questions and sort of question what I was hearing and kind of processing that, thinking about how do these models, what are the assumptions that are made in these models that lead to these results? But I largely kept quiet because I too had been acculturated in the rules that you kept quiet until you got tenure. And I was kind of like, all right, I can do that. I can be quiet for a while. I ended up, after teaching at Duke for a short spell, going to Barnard College, where I had an opportunity to teach a course on women in the economy, a course that had one of the first courses of its time at colleges and had an illustrious history behind it in terms of who had taught it me before. And that's where I started. My students started asking the same questions that I had been asking about these models that we were learning. And that got me to kind of rethink the ways in which I had sort of just stuck with my industrial organization, which was also my field in graduate school, and stayed away from these kinds of topics. And then I found community on this email chain. Now you have to realize this is the days, internet still was kind of a new thing, and there weren't listservs. You just all were on a chain email list with AOL accounts mostly, I think. And it was a chain set of emails of economists, primarily women economists, asking the questions that were being asked of me by my students and that I had asked myself when I was in graduate school. And this was exciting, but I kind of stayed as a lurker in that space because I had gotten much more deeply engaged in a community that was emerging of black economists looking at issues of race. And I had a contemporary, a wonderful woman named Rhonda Williams, who had gotten more involved on the feminist economics side. And we would periodically check in with each other. We only have so much bandwidth, so we'll spend on this kind of thing. So part of the reason why I'm here now is the untimely early death of Rhonda Williams, who was one of the founding people in the founding of feminist economics. Because we had in fact, feminist economics created a special issue on race, gender, color, and caste. And I was asked to become one of the editors of that special issue. And that's something that I'm really grateful, again, to Diana for bringing me in on this, because it was this moment where I finally got to go back to the kinds of issues that had attracted me to economics in the first place, and to underscore just the importance of feminist economics as a journal, particularly for those of you who are not academics. Just want to reinforce what Myra said about you need an outlet to be able to publish this work. It's, you know, the coin of the realm in the academic professions is the ability to publish. And so having this journal gave me the space and gave this space to the many contributors to our special issue to be able to write on these topics and to have a place where they could be validated as important parts of economics itself. But what I really want to talk a little bit about here, because I think you heard a lot about some of the issues that absorbed feminist economics earlier, is a bit about some of the innovation that feminist economics has brought to the field of academic journals. And I think it's sometimes the part you don't see as visibly as others. How many of you in the room have ever had a paper rejected from an academic journal? Okay. I remember one of my first rejection letters. I used to save them. I don't know where they are now. But I remember one that just said, I just don't like models of this type, rejected. And that was a pretty common practice. Also is the sense that in many academic journals, there is an editor who has really a kind of all-powerful role in determining what the journal's editorial policies will be. But in creating feminist economics, Diana strove to create it as a feminist decision-making process and brought people around the table to talk about editorial policies, to set up rules, built a process to have a developmental approach to how you review articles and to how you respond to writers, even when you're turning down their articles. And also, eventually, developing an approach where there was assistance built into the process to make papers better. Papers would get coaching assistance from mentors in some cases, particularly if they were papers from scholars in the Global South who might not have had as many opportunities to test this or to have their research read by others. And built-in editorial staff that made papers readable, which then makes them more citable by people who are picking up the journal itself. And then, really importantly, work to diversify who submitted to the journal, to pay attention to issues such as, are there economists of color from the US, or are there economists from the Global South? Are there non-economists who are working on economic issues that are sending their papers to the journal? So as a result, in feminist economics, you have a kind of snapshot of all of the work that's being done on these kind of critical questions of provisioning. Some of it coming from within the economics profession, some of it coming from adjacent fields, some of it coming from people who are academic scholars, and also importantly, because this is highly unusual in economics, some of it coming from people who are really practitioners, people who are out in the field trying to make a difference in the lives of women and children around the world. And that last piece, I've gotten to see a bit more up front and in person since I changed careers about 11 years ago. So 11 years ago, I left academia, and I came to the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. And while at the foundation, I got involved in a large-scale grant-making program called 100 and Change, where we offer a single grant of $100 million to solve a problem or take a big slice of a problem. We don't define the problem, we don't define where it is, so it's a big open call grant-making process. And then since then, we launched another nonprofit called Lever for Change that also runs these large-scale open call challenges with some of the goals of diversifying who's getting grant funding, what types of organizations, and what kinds of problems get attention. Just as an aside, it's worth noting that less than 2% of philanthropic dollars in the world go to issues related to women and children. It's kind of stunning statistic, isn't it? But through that process, I've had the amazing opportunity of talking to social entrepreneurs, to people working in different parts of the globe. And indeed, last week I was at the Skoll World Forum, which is a kind of convening of social entrepreneurs from around the world. And one of the things that strikes me as I talk to this, and this is important to me because we tend to, as academics, focus a lot on the metrics of citations as a measure of impact. But feminist economics has always had an agenda that's broader than that. That we're not only interested in changing economics, we want to change the world, basically. We want to change how economic systems work. And in this conversation on a workshop on gender-based violence, what struck me were the kinds of concepts that had been developed through the work of feminist economics, represented in papers that appeared in the Feminist Economics Journal, that I'm not sure anybody there had read, but I'm fairly confident that there has been a kind of dispersion of those ideas. And indeed, I think it would be interesting. I've been trying to spend some time going through looking at who the staffing are at these organizations to get a sense of it. Feminist Economics, the Feminist Economics Journal, has produced a special issue on asset building and the importance of asset ownership for women. And this is a topic that was being discussed among this group of entrepreneurs about things like land rights and how do you secure those. We've heard a little bit about care labor as an important part of what is happening in terms of affecting economic outcomes. And that's another element that appeared there in this conversation. There's a focus on intersectionality, an idea that is developed in the Feminist Economics Journal. And a real understanding of the importance of thinking about the work that does not happen in the formal economy that isn't necessarily compensated, that includes the unpaid labor of individuals. So all of these suggest to me that feminist economics and the journal have had an impact beyond citations, beyond the academy, but have actually infiltrated and changed the way that people think about how you achieve economic growth and success. And that is one of the things to celebrate today. In closing, I want to share a poem that has become a favorite of mine recently that I think captures precisely this project we're here to celebrate today, and I think might also resonate particularly with Diana. It's called Won't You Celebrate With Me? It's by the poet Lucille Clifton. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight, my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed.
Well, the problem with coming third is that a lot of the things have already been said. But I have three things that I really want to emphasize today, and about the journal and about its founding editor, Diana Strassmann. And I begin with enabling voice. I think it's very hard to communicate to people outside the economics discipline about how economics is a monolithic structure. It has a specific methodology, it has a specific set of approaches, and it has a narrow conceptualization of its subject matter. And if you, even as an economist, want to work even in a slightly different way, on a slightly different approach, and some rather unusual subjects, you are not doing economics. And you've already heard this, and you've heard from people's personal reflections on being told, you're not doing economics. But I want to get this across by talking to you about, and this is going to take you out of the US, talking to you about something that's going on in my country, the UK, and this is the post office scandal. Who's heard of the post office scandal? Okay. So the post office is a national level, ex-nationalized industry, now privatized, institution, which joins forces with lots of little small businesses, often run by Asian Brits because they're prepared to put in the hours of labor that's needed to run convenience stores. And in 1999, the post office introduced some new software from Horizon that it had bought from Fujitsu. This software was faulty, but it was not acknowledged to be faulty. Even when the CEOs, it was revealed to them that this software was faulty. And sub-postmasters and mistresses up and down the country began to not be able to balance the books. But they had signed a contract with the post office to say that any losses were their personal responsibility. So they had to pay these funds back to the post office. And this was not a matter of small change. This was hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of pounds. So, what happened? Well, people, of course, said, well, it's not, I haven't stolen the money, I haven't, and they were told, you are stupid, or you are a thief, because you alone are experiencing these problems. Nobody else has any difficulties with this software. It, in fact, is working perfectly. You alone are facing these problems. And you must be either incompetent or you're trying to steal the mantle of the post office. So, of course, what happened is a scandal, a national scandal. 900 people were prosecuted. People lost their livelihoods, they lost their savings, they lost their reputation, they lost their families, they lost everything. And then, of course, somebody decided to put people in touch with each other, to create a network of post office masters and mistresses, which soon revealed they were not alone. It wasn't just their books that wouldn't balance, it was the whole damn system. And of course, eventually, some prosecutions have been overturned, although this process is moving very slowly. And in fact, there is now a public inquiry, and the people who were in charge of this system, who knew the software was faulty but nonetheless pursued the prosecutions, may well go to prison. The moral of this is how important it was to tell people, to put people in touch, to tell people they were not alone. It wasn't only them that thought, wait a minute, economics isn't really talking about why women always seem to get low-paid jobs. Can it really be that they prefer low-paid jobs? It wasn't. It's an economics that didn't explain why it was, even though somebody had raised this a century earlier, why it was that if a man married his housekeeper, national income fell. Bringing this up to date, my own topic at the moment, if a woman decides to breastfeed her baby, national income falls because she's not buying the formula that is an inferior substitute for her own human milk. These are really weird aspects of modern economics. So, what feminist economics did was it gave voice to people. It put people in touch with each other. It published papers. You've heard about some of those wonderful papers. The first issue, contains some great papers still that I constantly reread and tell my students to read. And it made feminist economists, not all women, it made them realize that they were not alone in having these questions and having these anxieties and concerns about their subject. So, this empowering meant that people didn't only do their own work, but they listened also, they gave back to economics. And I think this is something that Diana Strassmann raised in her introduction to the journal in that very first issue. She said, we want to engage with mainstream economics, but we want to challenge it as well as be listened to by it. So it's not, we are in a dialogue with economics mainstream. And that's another wonderful thing that the journal Feminist Economics has given us. And the third way in which feminist economics has enriched the mainstream is, of course, because the ideas from feminist economics have seeped into, they've trickled into the mainstream in the way that Cecilia just described and the way that Myra talked about initially. So that now the mainstream is interested in issues around the value of unpaid work, and the mainstream will sometimes listen to issues around the crowding of women into certain kinds of jobs and the problems with whether or not you can in fact publicly fund daycare centers, for example, where the children are public goods. These issues are seeping into the mainstream of economics. However, you might then be thinking, well, is feminist economics still relevant? Do we really need it? If, in fact, the mainstream are picking up some of these ideas that gender is important in economic analyses. You might also be thinking, if you are an economist, economics has changed. It used to be, you know, economists are really, they really secretly admire scientists. And so they really want to be scientists, even though, of course, what they're dealing with is society, which is rather difficult to analyze scientifically. So it used to be, when we all started, it's what we've been talking about, it used to be that physics was the big model. You have elaborate mathematical models, and you can simulate those models and so on. And you search for equilibrium. These are all ideas that were taken from physics. That's gone by the wayside. So now the science model is medicine. And what we have now is a search for random control trials. Because if you have a random control trial, so you have one group of people who are, and the word is literally used, treated. They're treated in one way, and another group of people randomly selected who are not treated, then you can identify the outcome of the treatment as causal. And that is something economists really lust after. I must be able to show that my story is causal. So they do field experiments where they try and recreate these random control trials. Or, more usually, because field experiments are very, very expensive, and often, of course, immoral if you're treating one group and not treating another group. It raises all kinds of moral issues. So what is normally done is you ransack evidence looking for as-if random control trials. But they're not usually anywhere near random. So then, oh dear, we're losing our scientific explanation of causality. So what we have to do is create a battery of econometric techniques that counteract the fact that it's not really random. If the allocation was random, you just look at difference of means, and that would demonstrate the different treatments had effects. But since it's not random, we need a battery of ever more sophisticated econometrics. And that creates, of course, a whole new set of issues. Yes. So this leads to ever more sophisticated econometrics and the same fetishization of complex statistical methods that we grew up with, that we fled from in some ways. And often used to demonstrate inconsequential points, and continuing to suggest that economics can be totally objective and value-free, which feminist economists think are dangerous claims. So I'm afraid, although we are optimistic in some ways, feminist economics has had a limited impact on the mainstream. The citations for the journal have gone up, and that is, citations are one way we can look at impact. And I agree with Cece that some of the interest, the journal has never been particularly focused just on getting citation rates up. And you might also be thinking, yes, but Claudia Goldin got the Nobel Prize and she works on women. Well, there is reason to celebrate Goldin's Nobel Prize, but we have to also acknowledge the limitations of her work. One of the objectives of feminist economics from its beginning is what today we would call intersectionality, the overlapping modes of oppression and privilege based on gender, race, class, and other social categories. Goldin's focus is more or less exclusively in recent work on white, middle-class, college-educated women. And one of her major policy prescriptions that comes out of the very fine book that she's written, Family and Career, is to cheapen childcare costs. Well, go back to Myra's paper in the very first issue of Feminist Economics. With cheapening childcare costs, what does that mean? It means lowering the wages of workers in childcare centres. And of course, that raises questions then. These are women too. So
80% of the childcare budget is salaries.
yes, okay. Thanks, Myra. So if we go back to the subjects that were covered in that very first issue, they are subjects that still need feminist economics today, in my view. And so I would argue that although we have seen progress, we have seen issues that feminist economists have raised, methodologies that they have advocated, they have enriched and developed the mainstream of economics, but not enough. And we still need our journal. And this brings me, in fact, to my final point of my three. I've had a long career in many different institutions, a long and very happy career. And I've been involved with many journals, and I know the labor that goes into sustaining them, both day to day and in terms of their strategic management, their financial, their institutional, their intellectual management. And I think we have to acknowledge today the long support of Rice University in supporting our journal in these ways. But even more important than Rice University has been the efforts of FE's founding editor and continuing editor-at-large, Diana Strassmann. Without Diana, there would be no feminist economics, I'm pretty sure of that. The journal would never have got off the ground, and it would certainly never have survived. And it is a journal that is unique, not just, although I've tried to tell you how incredibly unique it is in terms of its subject matter, its focus, the way it's developed, its arguments and so on, but it's also unique in terms of its community here in Houston. I had lunch today with the people who Diana has recruited to work on the journal, and I've never heard so many wonderful stories about how people came to work on the journal, and they worked and they did things that they didn't really know about at first, and they learned, they accumulated human capital, and they took that human capital out into the wider world, maybe to do some of the things that Cecilia talked about in terms of spreading feminist economics outside academia into other avenues of human endeavor. So all this valuable work and the journal that I actually love, and I've published in it at various points in my career on various different issues as I've changed my own research focus. I none of this would have happened without Diana. So I too want to personally thank Diana very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to speak briefly now, and I do want to just make a few comments on a few of the topics that the journal has moved economic discussions further on. People often think, oh, discrimination, lower pay for women, and so forth, but not everyone is aware that if you take a feminist lens to economics, it goes into fields that people don't really think of as having anything to do with women. So, for example, macroeconomics, which is typically about the overall economy and how it functions, for example. And this is not going to be an economics lecture. I'm just going to give one small little example just to give you an idea of the types of insights that feminist economists have brought to the foray. And so this example is really a story about, suppose we have a country that decides that, which happened a lot, and it continues to happen, that they have to do some budget cutting because of austerity or whatever. And so one of the things they might decide to do is to reduce health care benefits, which again, you would think, well, it affects everyone. Why would we need a feminist lens for that? But suppose you are parents of a child who has a serious health condition like asthma or something that's not uncommon, and your child gets less preventative health care, then is sick more often as a result, and because of the gender norms, which is the parent that is going to stay home with that kid when they're too sick to go to school or needs to just be nursed back to health? It'll be the woman. And as a result, that means that women's labor force participation, which is the the rate in which women are participating in the paid workforce, will go down, and that will reverberate into the macroeconomy. And so if one is doing a budget cutbacks and wants to think about, well, how is that going to affect the economic growth and how the economy is moving, if you don't take into account gender norms and the effect on children and unpaid work, your economic projections are not going to be as accurate as they would be if you took into account these factors that a feminist lens has uncovered matter to the whole economy. And this is just one example, but there are many, many other instances of this sort that really shows that this is not just about kind of economic theory, it's about economic policies that affect real human lives. And part of our mission in caring about all lives and in bringing in more voices has been that we will not, those who started this journal and who were the first feminist economists, we are all in a position of privilege because we got PhDs and we got higher education. And there are voices from other parts of the world or communities that may have not had the same access to the ability to have their points of view about the world or their experiences represented. And one of the things that I'm the most proud of that we accomplished through our mentoring and figuring out how to publish people who don't know how to publish in journals is we now publish many, many articles from scholars from the South, developing countries, many more articles from people who may not really have the know-how how to write in this field and so forth. So I'm very happy about that. I also want to say that I do feel a little sad that the journal is going to be leaving Rice with my retirement. And I am sad that the Rice Econ department still has never offered, unless I taught it, sort of under, in either not as an official course that was regularly offered, any course in the economics of gender. So there's work to be done, including here at Rice. Nonetheless, it is, I want to thank David, who's here, our past Rice president, for continuing to support the journal, and his predecessor, who helped me move forward and hire the amazing students and staff who really together helped make the journal something from nothing. And anyway, so thanks to all of you. You know who you are. Our original intent was to have a conversation with the speakers, but I think that maybe we'll go right into questions from the audience, and with the opportunity for everyone to respond and participate should they like. So let's take it from there. Catherine.
Several of you mentioned child care, and there's clearly a lot of resonance with that for most of the room. Can someone comment on why certain other countries, particularly the ones I'm mildly familiar with, or in Scandinavia, do such a much better job of providing the kinds of arrangements and support for the whole country? I mean, what's going on in the UK and particularly in the US, just for those countries that are represented here? Many of us, I mean, I'm not trying to address the global south or developing countries or anything, but just why are Finland, Denmark, so forth, doing such a better job in that arena? That's my question.
So I'll start, and I'm sure that Myra is going to want to pick up on this. I think there is a big question about the notion of social supports that is quite different among the countries you noted, and the Anglophone countries generally are less likely, but everybody's pretty much better than we are. UK is up with us. So I wanted to make two notes. One is that some of the origins, though, of this, I would like to think it was origins around concerns about birth rates in many countries, about particularly the post-World War II. But there was a real interest in falling birth rates, and you see this conversation happening in other countries now, like in Italy and so on, that the recognition that if the country wants to replicate itself, then it has to make it easier, lower cost. So there was a bit of that was part of the underpinnings. Even though that is part of the underpinnings, the fact is that has led it to be institutionalized in a way that's not likely here. The other thing I wanted to note is that occasionally when you're listening to people who argue for less regulated markets and so on, they'll talk about Singapore. And Singapore is kind of interesting because Singapore, first of all, something like 80% of the population lives in what they call socialized housing, which is publicly subsidized, and every one of those housing units has childcare.
I think that I was in Scandinavia last summer, and my sense of it is that they have a concern for one another that we don't have. We are really based on the notion of individualism. The individual is supreme and is going to take care of him or herself. And only when that fails drastically do we then think about how to help that person. My colleagues who wouldn't let me speak at that seminar I talked about, they didn't quite say that we should stop funding education, but they wanted to say that parents were responsible for their children. And by God, if they weren't, they shouldn't have them. And it isn't the role of the state or employers or anybody else to figure out how to take care of those children. If they can't figure it out, either don't have them or the mother should stay home, and in any case, please leave me alone, I'm going back to my work or to my tennis or whatever.
Can I just step in here with a couple of points too, because the Scandinavian model, of course, also embraces very generous paternal leave as well as maternal leave. So there's an egalitarian responsibility within families for childcare, and I think that feeds through into public policy. If the job is just for women, then I think that structures the public response too. But also there really is an element of need of planning here, because in Britain, the government just announced that it would subsidize more hours of childcare for working parents, only to discover that those places are not available in childcare centres, because there's nobody wants to teach and care for children in childcare centres because the pay's so low and the conditions are so wretched. The circumstances that Myra uncovered in 1995 in the US still prevail today. And of course, we've also recently had a very vivid illustration of the problems with caring labor, and that was COVID. You know, when all these systems basically were in retreat, and who picked up the pieces? Others.
Yeah, others. There's also an effort here underway that looks at the other side of this market, and it goes back to not only caregiving in terms of childcare, but also looking at caregiving at the other end, as you noted. There's initiatives around organizing both caregivers and the people they care for to advocate for stronger supports for good wages, good benefits, and creating these as the important jobs that they are to the economy, the recognition of their importance to the economy. And that's a kind of growing movement that does give me some cause for optimism.
And I want to add just one other quick comment about this. Is one of my favorite articles that we published in Feminist Economics, Volume 5, Number 3, by Julie Nelson. Is it okay to pay well for care? Because one of the, in our first issue, we published an article by Nancy Folbray called Holding Hands at Midnight, The Paradox of Caring Labor, in which she pointed out that sometimes people think care is better if people do it out of altruism, you know, because they love the person whom they're caring for so much, so that if you're taking care of your grandparent or your own child and you're not paid for it, that's higher quality care than if somebody is paid for it. But one of the things she points out in this piece is that if care is really badly paid, people who might be amazing caregivers can't afford to do it because they need to support their families. And they'll go and take some higher paying job. And so as a society, if we don't pay well for care, and if it's a public good, it requires government subsidy in order for economic optimality to be achieved. Anyway, so that's some of the debates we've had.
I'll just say one thing, and don't take this to mean that I agree, but I just want to put this on the table. I once had Angela Davis. Everybody remember who Angela Davis was? Angela Davis was visiting something at Stanford, and she came to my class to talk. And she said that she thought the single most radical, imagine coming from her, the single most radical, that could possibly happen in the United States, there would be 24/7 free childcare. So I don't know that that's a good thing. I mean, we'd have to look at that more carefully, but it is interesting that that's where she went with it.
Great. Well, we'll answer at great length for every single question. We'll see how many we get to. Okay. Somebody way back there? Yep, you. Wait, can you wait?
Hi. As I was listening to everyone speak, it occurred to me I was hearing the concept public policy, but then I was not hearing about any connections that feminist economics or feminist economists have with the making of public policy. I have been sitting here, sorry, I was not ignoring, but I took a moment to check to see how many of our members of the United States Congress are economists. And then I started thinking about, we are so preoccupied with having more women in our national, state, local governments. But then how many of the women that are there, which is still a very low number, how many of them are economists? And I'm thinking that it would probably be, all of this is wonderful stuff, get everybody energized. But then if you don't have people in place who can bring about public policy making, who care about it because they have firsthand knowledge of it. I mean, right now you got a whole lot of guys, and most of them are not even economists, which might make it worse, because if this is the problem you're having with not enough women in economics, then you might not have it that good in government policy. So I'm just wondering, have you ever decided that you could just form a
Political party?
a lobbying group, you know, lobby for it, have just set up so that you have women who are feminist economists, because I'm thinking you can't be a woman economist and not be feminist. I just
Well,
don't
you
see
can.
It. You can?
You
Oh,
can.
I am so sorry. I'm
It's
a
okay.
political scientist, okay?
So-
I'm sorry. I'm not,
So a
we have
couple-
very few.
Yeah, a couple of things, Wanda. First of all, I actually spent some time once going through congressional testimonies to look at when feminist economists were present. And there's sort of a very early set of testimonies around the gender gap in the labor market, pay and so on, when one of the other kind of luminaries in feminist economics, Barbara Bergman, was frequently brought in to testify, but the other person across the aisle was another woman economist to talk about why it was that women were paid less. More recently, Randy Abelda has been very active in testifying in congressional hearings about issues around poverty, around inequality, and about about these issues such as childcare and so on. So there have been people who are actively doing this, but it is I think there is more we could probably organize around. At various points, I think the journal has tried to do policy briefs based on stuff in journals. I don't know if you want to mention it.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that we've had symposia and explorations on various timely policy issues, so we have addressed a lot of these. There are also our policy makers who come to our conferences and so forth. I mean, a real issue is who's got the clout to get things implemented. And interestingly, there is a very important feminist economic concept that has been implemented in the EU, and that's called gender mainstreaming, and also gender budgeting, much more so. Anyway, but I don't want to talk too long. Let's hear for some other questions, and we can always talk more during the cocktail time afterwards on elaborations. Other questions? Did I see any other? Oh, well. Oh, go ahead, Sherry.
First, I want to thank all of you for your pioneering work. It's really Again, I want to thank all of you for your pioneering work. What I wanted to go back to was the pandemic, which laid bare the inequalities for childcare, for women dropping out of the workforce. Has that helped you advance your arguments, or has our memory already evaporated as to, how hard that was during that time and how many women left the workforce?
We did an entire special issue on the topic, so absolutely. But anybody want to say some more?
Part of the problem is that people who were making the rules about stopping schools, closing schools, and so on, really never considered schooling as childcare. you know. And so I think they were surprised when we had the result we had. You know, people thought that the purpose of schooling was to educate kids. And nobody thought that part of it is, you know, to allow their parents to work. So that is a big lesson, which I think has been learned.
I would add one other small one, which I'm not sure is how long it's going to stick, but it was the recognition of the fact that older girls, largely, end up bearing a lot of the child care responsibility, and that affects their performance in school. And even though it's something that should have been recognized, I'm not sure it was really recognized in the way that I think education, at least education funders, are thinking about now.
Thank you. I think maybe one more question. Dinesh, did you have a?
Sure. So
Here, let me.
I think I want to continue some of things people have asked and you've already said. But based on your work, are there any examples of real policy or successful initiatives that's been taken in the US and outside based on the study? And second fold of that question is, has your study or initiative intersected with other social justice issues like LGBTQ and that sort of thing?
I'm proud to say that Feminist Economics was the first economics journal to publish an article on discrimination related to LGBT sexual orientation. We've got a special issue in the works right now. We've had another special issue. So we've published a lot in that area. On having success in policy, I want to say, and others may have more to say, but the idea that you actually have to look at how people spend their time and keep track of it, if it is unpaid, and incorporate that into national income accounts and other studies. So do you want to say more?
Satellite income accounts now are generally accepted that we need to pay attention to unpaid care work and unpaid work of other kinds as well. So the National Income Accounting Framework now includes these satellite income accounts. The real problem is that they require time use studies, and the development of time use studies has been very slow, but that's the feminist economists are continuing to lobby on that front. So I think that is a policy intervention that's had real fruit.
And do you want to say something about gender budgeting?
And gender budgeting in the UK is also very important, so that, gender budgeting involves looking at any expenditure and income shifts that the government might be contemplating, taxation changes and so on, and explicitly analysing what they mean for men and women separately. So, this is a group at work really digging into the nitty-gritty of these kinds of changes and then coming up with an explanation of what they might mean for men and women and families in different circumstances. So I think that's another very important policy shift.
The other one I'll note is that there is this dominant model in neoclassical economics about households and how households worked that basically said that that meant that they didn't call them men, but there was a head of household, and the head of household,
the male breadwinner,
breadwinner was altruistic, and so it didn't recognize that there's bargaining about the division of household resources and how they get allocated. And some of the work of feminist economics helped to uncover that when you're giving out grants or support, you actually get different results depending on who you distribute the funds to. And that has actually changed the way development assistance and other things have now started to be distributed across the country, across the world. We don't do it so much here.
But we should also notice that feminist economics has been very powerful in pointing out that this male breadwinner model is only relevant to a small proportion of households. Very many households don't have a male breadwinner at all. They have two earners, the Scandinavian two-earner families. They have, in fact, some households have a male who is not a breadwinner, but who is dependent on other household members' work and energy. So I think feminist economics has pointed to the great variety in household structures, and that male breadwinner model is a vision that is only partially reflects social reality.
And so in the Global South, distributing funds to the mother has resulted in an increase in schooling, particularly for girls, but for both children.
And even in the growth of children, that if the food is given to the mother, the children grow more.
And they go to school for longer.
Yeah. I would love to, we could all talk at great length, but we are aware that we're a few minutes past the end of the panel time, so we invite you to join us for cocktails or I guess whatever we're serving back there, beer, wine, soft drinks, maybe that's all there is, I'm not sure, and some snacks, and you can talk to us some more, and a radical idea, maybe read the journal. That might answer some.